So my task is to introduce the last book in the series, which is my colleague Rachel's book, No Useless Mouth, Waging War and Fighting Hunger in the American Revolution. And I read it on my iPad using the free Kindle version, so here you can go look at the cover image. I learned so much from No Useless Mouth, starting with the right way of pronouncing the word victual, which I always mispronounce literally as victual. So No Useless Mouth is a brilliant account of the role that food and the absence of food played in determining the outcome and aftermath of the American Revolution. It shows that food policy, fighting hunger, could be seen as part of a triad with warfare and diplomacy, but also as an extension of these two as well. The exchange of food was an essential part of early modern diplomacy and frequently used for the making of alliances and peace. Victual warfare involved the stealing or destroying of the enemy's grain supply or animals or other foodstuffs with the aim of weakening their defenses and strengthening one's own. Both food diplomacy and victual warfare were essential to the history of the later United States, the future United States, and the myths that now surround it. We only have to think of the Thanksgiving dinner that the first pilgrims shared with the Wampanoag Indians. In her book, Rachel also introduces a third concept, namely victual imperialism, in which one side uses food policy, food laws, strategies for hunger prevention as a way of establishing its authority over the other side in a conflict. So on one level, the concepts that Rachel introduces and uses are timeless and of value to the study of conflict at every time and place. Every army marches on its stomach, and Rachel makes comparisons with scorched earth tactics used by the English in 17th century Ireland, for instance. No Useless Mouth provides some harrowing examples of similar destruction of fields and communities during the Revolutionary Wars. In 1779, the destruction of British allied Iroquois by the Patriots earned George Washington the name of Conotocharius, the devourer of villages, which I think is not something you would see on a pedestal somewhere or anywhere. At the same time, these factors play out in a context of intercultural exchange, and this means that neither food diplomacy nor victual warfare nor victual imperialism play out in the way that I, as an early modern Europeanist, would expect them to. Native tribes and nations, when they visited their British, French, or Patriot friends for assistance, would expect to be fed gargantuan amounts of food because such consumption solidified alliances. And most strikingly for me was the fact that hunger could play the same function, that allies, native and non-native, could also hunger together as a way of forming closer bonds. And Indians would even go so far as to destroy their allies' food supplies in order to achieve this. So all of this, in turn, feeds into different, often self-serving ways in which natives and non-natives saw each other. So the excessive appetites of the Indians served to exoticize them, and which, in turn, legitimated American victual imperialism. Teaching Indians how to feed themselves properly using American methods legitimated taking away the surplus lands that sedentary Indians no longer needed. So the real eye-opener for me are the implications of this book putting these two factors, the cold politics of food and the intercultural dialogue, together, because it shows the natives' position of strength and the comparative weakness of the non-natives. Both the overconsumption of food and the ostentatious going without food show that natives had real agency. It was the non-natives who had to learn native diplomatic practices and use them. Rachel's book has some absolutely amazing examples of especially American cock-ups on that front, where they fail to learn the right diplomatic codes, but which Rachel herself really carefully deciphers. And it was the non-natives who had to feed the natives to keep them on board. So in fact, up to the mid-1790s, natives were able to play off different non-native groups. The French against the British against the Patriots, and the individual states against the new federal government. So No Useless Mouth is an absolute triumph of a book, and I can't really do it justice in 5 minutes. I haven't even mentioned the ways former enslaved persons used food to gain agency for themselves, or the way that the book has tentacles that reach all the way to Nova Scotia and even to Sierra Leone. But the good news is that the book is available open access, and therefore I would encourage anyone with an interest in food, race, or conflict to read it. So that was sort of my presentation. I really hope that I didn't mispronounce the names of various tribes and people too terribly. I don't know if Rachel has anything to sort of say in response.
Thanks for that, Jan. I think the only thing I would add is that as I was kind of finishing the book, trying to get the introduction and the conclusion into shape, I was at Cardiff and thinking more about history as a discipline than I had in my previous jobs. And what I really wanted to get across was the sort of point that Native American and formerly enslaved communities were really good at preventing hunger themselves and had an established history of doing that. Shorter for formerly enslaved communities in Nova Scotia and Sierra Leone, but still extant. And what stopped those abilities was the misuse of history. And so, I think I thought more as a result of my teaching on history and practice and other modules at Cardiff, like exploring historical debate, about the purpose of history and about the tensions between history and disciplines like Native American studies. And I wanted a way to kind of express my discomfort as a historian and with the historical discipline, to explore how it had been damaging to some of those previous relationships. So, yeah.
Actually, a really, really interesting point in your book that I really should have, tried to shove into my presentation. I love the discussion of history and the abuse of history, sort of, and the way that people in the 18th century already had preconceived histories of colonization, conquest, and the way that those narratives, sort of like squared off against each other was fantastic.
Thanks.
Congrats again.
Thank you.